This episode of Recording Studio Rockstars is brought to you by OWC and JZ Microphones. So get ready to rock.
If you send me a mix and it already has an L1, L2, L3, whatever you're mixing through to estimate what I'm going to do to it, chances are, you have limited my options greatly. Really, things should only be peak limited once.
Welcome to Recording Studio Rockstars. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is the podcast created to help you become a rock star of the recording studio. This episode is sponsored by OWC, Otherworld Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, your trusted source for memory and speed upgrades, DIY installs, and used Macs for your studio. Let OWC focus on keeping your studio Mac in killer condition so that you can focus on making great music. Why ditch your existing Mac when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and learn how you can supercharge your studio Mac. The speed to create, the capacity to dream. Now find out how awesome your studio can be at OWC. This episode is sponsored by JZ Microphones with a unique golden drop capsule design. The Vintage Series V67 and V11 microphones offer Class A discrete amplifier circuitry, extremely low self-noise, and advanced built-in shock mount technology to bring a rich, warm sound to your studio with crisp clarity and detail that will make you wish that you had discovered these mics a whole lot sooner. Go to jzmic.com or click the link in the show notes below and use the limited time coupon ROCKSTAR right now to get 50% off their Vintage Series microphones. Hey Rockstars, it's your host Lid Shaw. Welcome back to Recording Studio Rockstars, bringing you into the studio to learn from recording professionals so that you can make your best record ever and be a rock star of the studio yourself. My guest today is Andy Vandette, a mastering engineer who started his career interning at the legendary Masterdisk under Bob Ludwig. After completing his degree in Tonmeister Studies, he was hired full-time, and during the CDs explosion, he spent time with other mastering luminaries like Tony Dawsey, Howie Weinberg, Fulginiti, Calbi, and Vlado Meller. He learned more than just how to master and cut vinyl. He observed their perspectives on processing and musicality, and by the time the MFiT, which is mastered for iTunes standard, was introduced, Andy had been chief engineer for 14 years and had mastered classic albums from the Beastie Boys, Uncle Kracker, Whitney Houston, David Bowie, Rush, Deep Purple, Porcupine Tree, Dream Theater, and many more. During the past 5 years at Engine Room Audio in New York City, he has continued that success with charting and award-winning projects from Seven Dust, Snotam Quar, Headstones, Big Wreck, Devin Townsend, Matthew Good, Hands Like Houses, Wiz Khalifa, Devour the Day, Thank You Scientist, and plenty of other artists from around the world. Andy has also spoken at audio schools, AES conventions, interviewed for the New York Times, Ars Technica Sonic Scoop music players, and presented Friends Don't Let Friends Press Bad Vinyl at South by Southwest in 2015. A classically trained musician from a musical family, Andy's seen all sides of the music business, whether mastering, recording, on stage with a band, or being a vocalist on jingles for Nickelodeon and 150-plus store chains around the USA. Thank you also to Slough Howleton for making our introduction. Andy and I have been trying to set up this interview for quite some time, and I'm super psyched to have Andy on the show. Please welcome Andy Vandette to Recording Studio Rockstars. Andy, are you ready to rock, dude?
Hell yeah.
Dude, it's great to have you here. And as I was saying before we rolled, you really did a wonderful job of sending me links to your music and your records on YouTube. So Rockstars, a reminder, we have a playlist together in the show notes where I put together a bunch of Andy's records, and man, they sound really good.
Oh, thank you.
Tell us a little more in your own words, briefly how you got, well, maybe not even that briefly. You've had such a great track record of getting started in mastering. Tell us the story of getting interested in this stuff and, the beginning of getting into recording and mastering for you.
Well, recording was kind of an outgrowth of, being in a band in high school and getting to that age where I had to try to figure out, what was the next step for me. And I had heard that there was a recording program. At the time, we're talking 1981. I was graduating from high school.
Dude, I think I just got my Atari 2600 at that point.
There were only 3 recording programs on the East Coast. And so one of them was the University of Miami. And let me tell you, my parents were not sending me to the University of Miami. There was Berkeley. My parents were not sending me to Berkeley. And the third one was a SUNY school, the State University College of New York at Fredonia, an hour south of my parents' house at the time. My brother and my sister both graduated from their music education program and were music teachers. My parents had attended that school. So, it was a really easy sell to my parents. Hey, I'm going to go to this Fredonia place and I'm going to attend the recording program. And, in the back of my mind, I was in a band, I was writing songs. So I had this dream that, maybe I could record an album's worth of material and, maybe get a record deal or maybe hook up with other musicians who were like-minded. And really from the musician angle, I didn't really think much about sound recording other than, I enjoyed things that had lights and buttons and pushing faders and, that kind of thing. But, I was young. I was very stupid. So I went there and did 3 years and noticed that the other students around me had been doing internships. And I had a dream. I wanted to do my internship at a studio called Boogie Hotel. It had been owned by Foghat out in lovely Port Jefferson, Long Island. And so I had the opportunity to go to the Audio Engineering Society convention in New York City to meet Bob Ludwig, who was one of the investors in that studio. And if you've never met Bob, he's just an incredible guy, and I had never experienced anything like Bob Ludwig.
He's kind of like the Santa Claus of making records. he sent us a letter for a record that he had mastered, and it really felt like Santa had written back to us.
Well, I don't know if I've ever thought of him as Santa, but, being young and stupid and inexperienced, coming out and meeting him, and here's a guy who's got 2 Neumann cutting lathes in his room. He's cutting, dual cutting. He's set up to cut 2 lacquers at a time from the original analog master. Remember, 1981, digital was not a thing yet.
Yeah.
The F1 format had come out.
Yeah.
And there were like the SoundStream and the 3M machines, but they, CDs weren't really in anyone's target yet. And so here's a guy who's making changes between songs, cutting sides, 2 lacquers at a time, taking phone calls. And while he's talking to me, I just felt like there was this incredible focus on me while all this stuff is going on. And at the end of our conversation, he said, well, yeah, Andy, I can probably make some calls and you can probably do your internship at Boogie Hotel. But why don't you want to do your internship here? And we were at Masterdisk. And, really my heart just melted. Oh my God, Bob Ludwig wants me to be in the tape library for a summer. I can't turn that down. So we kind of worked out a dual internship program where I was supposed to do Monday through Friday at Masterdisk, and then I would go out to Long Island on the weekends and work at Boogie Hotel. I have to say the Boogie Hotel thing never really happened in any manner, shape, or form. Either they didn't have a session, or at the time when they did have sessions, they kind of gained a reputation of having technical issues and being so far out on Long Island. It wasn't like being in Manhattan where there was a 24-hour-a-day Studer parts depot where you could go and, at 3 a.m. and get a new capstan.
Wow.
So it never really happened. And I actually never set foot in the place other than the initial interview. So I had spent my summer at Masterdisk primarily, doing what interns do, running packages. They had a giant room. No, I wouldn't say a giant room, a room full of client masters. And in the pre-internet days, when you had business policies that allowed people to basically show up with cash, get a set of lacquers cut, they get sent to the plant, and now it's 3 years later. Where do you find this band? Well, today, yes, the internet. I'll just type in the name of the band, and chances are you're going to find them. There was none of that. So I picked through their file cabinets and returned as many master tapes as I possibly could. And, that in itself was just a joy to me, because here I am weeding out from the master tape library old masters that were never going to be used again and going, oh my God, Bob mastered Rick Santers, an obscure Canadian that no one south of the border except for me had heard of. And I just found so many masters. There was like the original demo for a band called Cinderella that had gone on to hit it huge.
Wow.
It was just like a gold mine to me.
Well, and it gave you, an early appreciation for a history of making records at that point.
Yes, and to not take for granted that here is a studio at the top of its game. Howie Weinberg had just started doing huge records, and Tony Dawsey he was mastering at that point, but hadn't really done the notable artists that he ended up doing.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I, not a side note, but summertime in New York, being in a well air-conditioned tape library might have been a pretty good place to be as an intern at that point.
Yes.
Sure, there were less comfortable internships you could have had. Well, very cool. So how long were you there? Now you started, that was the beginning of Masterdisk, and then you ended up being there for 14 years and as head engineer. Is that right?
Well, it was a slow progression. I have to say, by the end of my internship summer, my young stupidity had taken hold again in my mind, and I was like, mastering? Screw that shit. I am a musician, man. I was born to sit behind the Neve, program the flying faders, man. That's me. And I had heard enough stories from other interns coming back from their internships, and some of them had ended up in jingle studios. And they were telling these stories like, I showed up and the vocalist didn't show up for the session. So the engineer said, hey, why don't you get up there and you try it? And so I ended up singing on the demo, and then the client heard it and they loved it. And so here's this college student getting residual checks.
Right.
And so I was thinking that is me. I was always lead singer, bass player guy in my bands. And no matter how hard and coarse we tried to sound, people would come up to me after the show and go, wow, you guys just look so happy when you're up there. And I'd be like, that was my best sneer. What are you talking about? So I had this happy-go-lucky white boy sound, and I thought I could capitalize on it. And when I first got back to New York, I did connect with a jingle producer who was doing, you wouldn't call it for broadcast. It was more in-store broadcasting networks. And we did have some shots at major broadcast kind of spots. And most of them went nowhere. We did one for TGI Fridays. Ours was kind of...
That was my favorite place to go as a kid. Go get the potato skins loaded with cheese and bacon.
My favorite food groups. So, ours kind of sounded like Jerry Seinfeld theme, kind of funky, happy, and they went for the one that was like more Michael Bolton, Americana. And so... The last one was for a soft drink that was being marketed in the United States by the same guy who broke Arizona iced tea. And it was Samba, the taste of Brazil. And
Nice.
We did this spot, and we're all just elated in the room, going, "Wow, this is the first time we actually have the contract. This isn't a demo. We actually have the spot. The producer, the writer, he had the contract." And so, I'm seeing these residual checks in the sky. And it's about 6 months later, I check back with him going, whatever happened to Samba? And he says, "Andy, let me tell you, I had no idea when I first wrote the spot that there are 15 different types of Sambas. And wouldn't you know that I picked one of them that the client didn't like. So right off the bat, he immediately redid the music bed. And then the product test marketed so poorly in the United States that they yanked the whole campaign. So there goes Andy's residual checks out the window, high in the sky. Couldn't reach it no matter how high I jumped. But by then I was back at Masterdisk working full time. They started me as receptionist. And, I really have to thank Bob Ludwig and the manager then, Linda, who said, we got to hire Andy. The owner said, "Andy, he's an engineer. He's going to want to get back into the studios. There's no way he's going to sit out there and answer the phone and order lunch."
But he's got such a happy voice. It's the best person to answer the phone.
Yeah. I had no idea of this inner struggle that was going on. But, Bob had said, no, we hire from within. So, he's done his time as intern. There's a paid position, and let's see what he does with it. And so after 3 months, they took me off the phones, and I did the company billing. So every invoice that was generated at Masterdisk for probably the next 7 years.
Wow.
I did, but it also gave me the opportunity to get in to the studios. I worked for 2 years with Bob Ludwig's night guy, a guy named Alan Moy, who taught me how to cut vinyl records, and eventually went to bat for me and went to the management and the other staff and said, "This kid's ready."
Hey, you mentioned night guy, and I've heard that term used at some like Blackbird Studios down here. Is maybe break that down. What is a night guy, and do all studios have night guys, or is that sort of something of a past industry, or is that something that you consider when you've got a very successful commercial studio?
I would think that a night guy today is vastly different than a night guy back then, because when I started at Masterdisk, Bob Ludwig was doing 2 albums a day, and so someone needed to come in at night and be able to accurately read his notes to cut more vinyl parts, whether they be reference acetates or master lacquers that were going to go to the factory for production. Sometimes there would be some light revisions, like the third song on the A side, louder, softer, brighter, duller, whatever. But it was all based on Bob Ludwig's notes and being able to recreate what he had set up during the session and got approved. So I was taught the Bob Ludwig shorthand for, the setup of the gear, and was taught the same best practices that Bob's night guy was taught. Today, I have had assistant engineers pull up settings, recreate what I did, and then do that one click less bottom or that minor change for me occasionally. Generally, I do everything myself. It takes a long time to build up trust and to know that this person, they've got your career in their hands.
One of the reasons why starting at the phone and doing the billing is not absurd at all, because it's it's like interning in the studio, here, there's an idea. It's like, if you don't really take the lunch order seriously, why would everybody trust that you're going to take the actual record seriously?
I majorly scored in that when I had first started at Masterdisk full time, they were involved in cutting Bruce Springsteen, Born in the USA.
Oh, wow.
And over time, every engineer at Masterdisk cut at least one set of lacquers on that project because it was just such an over-the-top hit. There were no CDs. I got to keep reminding people that everything was vinyl, and every major record required that 3 sets of lacquers be cut and shipped to 3 different manufacturers in the United States. So you're talking 9 sets of lacquers on a major release, because it doesn't make sense to manufacture records in New York and ship them to California,
right,
or to the middle of the country. So they had manufacturing set up at West Coast, Central, and East Coast. And that record was just such an incredible hit that I'm sure Masterdisk was sending lacquers around the world, and multiple sets, lacquers create stampers, which eventually wear out.
Yeah, it's unlike digital, where you just do the job once, and now it's just a digital file that can get sent wherever. And
right.
You're welcome to correct me on that as soon as you want. But just generally speaking, with vinyl, you had to keep recreating that master to press more records.
Yes. Today it seems kind of absurd to me by digital standards that you could recreate. I mean, I have problems some days recalling my own settings, as simplistic as they might be, when I was remastering the Rush catalog. And I knew that, I must take meticulous notes, because when I hear this in my car tomorrow morning, I might want to make one small change, and I need to get back to where I was before I can make that small change.
Yeah.
And I would pull up the EQ the next day, and the tubes would sound different, or the humidity in the room, something in a direct blind A/B comparison, I could tell the old print from the new.
Wow.
Even though there was only 1 dB of EQ on it. Wow, what the hell? So, the thinking that you could actually cut it in a different studio that had exactly the same gear, by today's standards, I can hear the difference between the 2 Sony CD players that I had.
Wow.
Switching back and forth between them, have 2 identical discs, put them in the machines, and have a switch and a quick changing D to A converter. And I could pick out the difference between the 2 machines. And I would go to great lengths to try to fool myself, because it wasn't a digital AES router, it was actual cables. And so I would, haphazardly, not paying attention, plug in the cables and not really know which machine was connected to which input. And I would haphazardly switch the discs, and I would try to fool myself, and eventually I would say, yeah, nope, that's that top machine. So every analog device sounds different on different days.
Yeah, for sure. And, it's interesting to hear you talk about that too, because often we hear people make arguments that oh, you can't really hear the difference between this and that. And I've heard all kinds of differences that other people don't believe I could hear. and I wonder if sometimes, part of it is training ourselves to really be able to hear those differences as well. But anyway, that's a whole nother topic, but it's good to be reminded, how much of a difference there can be in the slightest changes between things. This show is sponsored by Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can go to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level. And you can start right now with my free Introduction to Mixing course, Mix Master Bundle. This course will show you how to get pro-sounding mixes from your home studio with free and stock plugins in Pro Tools. And the best part is that these mixing techniques will work for you in any DAW, whether you are in Logic, Cubase, PreSonus Studio One, Reaper, or anything you can think of. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, or look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. Now, what about pulling up digital files? Do you run into that just simply reopening a digital session sometimes? Is there stuff we need to be aware of where there's differences that we didn't expect?
You should always be looking for these differences that shouldn't exist. And the ones that I trust, I have pretty well taken the ones that failed the test out of my digital workflow. It's part of the reason I use the workstation that I use for the things that I use it for. And there are workstation things that I can't do within my primary workstation, and I, have to go to a secondary workstation.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I guess your point, if I'm understanding it too, is that, here we just take for granted things like, I'm going to open my Pro Tools session with 1,000 plugins in it, and it's going to sound exactly like it did yesterday. And theoretically, perhaps it should, but boy, is there a lot of math going on that you're relying on for that kind of stuff. And we do run into things getting updated, day to day or week to week or whatever, and that stuff can sneak in. So yeah, there's a lot of opportunity for things to change, and I guess it's good to be able to trust your ears.
I try as much as possible to never leave rendering for the future. So if there is a half dB tweak on one of the tracks, I'm going to print it so that really my workstation, when it's coming down to making a production master, is really just spitting out 2 tracks. It's not going to do any processing.
Yeah.
And that way I don't have to worry about maybe a plugin in the future getting an update and 2 years down the line, now I'm on a new computer and I go to open up this setting and, well, what do you know? It doesn't find the old version of the plugin.
Yeah, that's happened to me plenty of times.
Yeah.
It's a long, slow learning process to train myself to just, commit. And it's built into Pro Tools now. I mean, obviously, I'm talking about Pro Tools. Most of our listeners do use Pro Tools, although, the Rockstars also use all the other DAWs as well. And the ability to just be able to commit stuff and have just a series of mono and stereo tracks that are mixing together is a pretty awesome way to avoid some of that stuff. Yeah,
I mean, I don't think I could get away with it in the multi-track world, but in the stereo world or even the surround world, it's definitely the way to go.
So I like to ask guests to share an inspirational quote to kick us off. You've obviously worked with a lot of great mentors. Do you have anything that you want to share that kind of gets you excited about hitting the studio?
Well, I don't know if it gets me excited to work in the studio, but they are words to live by, and I have many. The first would be one that I'm sure you've heard a million times before: less is more.
Yeah.
Because every gig I have ever gotten, because another mastering engineer gave results that the client didn't like, it was generally because they over-affected a mix.
Mm.
And I have to say, of all the gigs that I might have lost over the years, and, I'm very lucky that has been very few, but those were because I over-affected a mix. You have to understand that by the time somebody sends a mix for mastering, somebody thinks it's pretty good.
Yeah.
And so for me to, get in there, it's really easy for a mastering engineer to be like, oh, yeah, I'm going to kill this one. This is, I'm going to pump up the bottom. I'm going to make sure everything's in your face all the time. And sometimes you come up with a client that's not the way to go, that they have already put it enough in your face.
Well, and I certainly go from mixing to mastering with, fingers crossed that the mastering engineer is going to make it sound better than, like a lot of times I might feel like I took it as far as I could go, and I'm like, I've got that artistic sense of self-doubt, confidence mixed with self-doubt, but everybody's worked hard on some aspect of it and feels like, well, this is the correct attitude or balance or character. And if that gets changed, then sure enough, I think people quickly go like, oh man, somehow you got rid of that thing that was good about it. So what helps you navigate the process of working with a client where you don't accidentally, delete what was good about it?
Well, just going into with the mindset that something is good about this. And I would say today, the norm is I end up doing one track ahead of the record. And, I like that because it gives me the opportunity to feel out a client and, how numb to compression are they? Yeah. And to work with them. And I can usually give them, sometimes there is one clear winner in my own shootouts when I'm running through various pieces of gear. If I hear something that's really good, I'm gonna render it. Why labor it? Just throw it down on the hard drive and then do a really good A/B comparison at the end. And if you get a couple things that are really good, send them to the client and say, hey, here's a couple things that I heard that I really liked. EQ1 sounds more like the master. EQ2 sounds more pushed.
Yeah. You're empowering the artist to make choices as well.
Sure. And feel them out. A lot of times if they say, oh, we've been listening to this quasi-mastered version, I will usually say, send it to me. Because once again, we're not quite out of the loudness wars yet, but just to find out where are they in their loudness and compression and EQ kind of mentality.
Yeah. And, I think that stuff also informs you about, how they're listening to it back. I mean, people listen on so many different systems and in different formats, and different loudnesses, I find, can make things sound better and worse in different places.
And they're in the environment in which they are listening. If they are going to listen purely on a laptop and earbuds, you're going to get a lot different feedback from someone who has, a giant sub and are listening to it on more of like a home theater kind of setup. Mm-hmm. Now, theoretically, mastered stuff is supposed to travel well, which is, part of our gig.
Well, we'll talk about that more for sure. So can you share also a story about an important failure for you? I mean, were there any times where that process didn't go so good, but it turned out to be a great learning experience?
Yes. I always, I like to say, what was the difference between me being chief engineer compared to someone like Howie Weinberg, who has so many gold and platinum records, he could basically replace the aluminum siding on my house with gold and platinum records. Why wasn't he chief engineer? And I like to say it's because I understand the definition of two words: always and never. Because if you always check your track starts on a CD master, you will never send out a master that has the mark has moved. And on every workstation I have ever worked on, sometimes a start ID moves. Why? I don't know. If I knew, then it would never happen. But if you always check your masters, you will never send out a blank one, which I have seen other engineers at the studio do.
Yeah, I've sent a client home with a CD that was messed up before, and it's Just the worst feeling. It's the worst.
The silent ones, especially. Oh, it's all zeros. Okay.
Yeah. And you know, I guess my version would be kind of what you said, which was learning to pop it out. I'd learn to pop it in the CD player, put on headphones, and quickly just check that each song plays. Because, you know, there wouldn't have been enough time to, like, you know, listen through the entire thing for some rough mixes. But at least avoiding sending people home with nothing is a good strategy.
I would also say never do something the first time on a pay gig. You know, whether you're using a new workstation, a new plugin, the first time through anything is a bitch. And there are things that can happen that you can't foresee because you've never done it before. So to make sure you have a little hands-on time before you actually jump in. Now, you know, I have been caught in all of these. That's why these are my workflow rules. And as long as I enforce the rules, I live a good life. Things are happy. I have happy clients. It's as soon as I am don't take the time or didn't have the time to truly do that, that is when I, you know, encounter a failure, angry clients, and that's not a good way to build clientele.
Yeah. You know, the never never using something for the first time, it reminds me to mention that, again, in the digital world, there's a lot of first times that are sneaking in on you. Everything's getting updated. You know, there's new revisions of things. And, you know, that's another reminder. You just rockstars, be very, very careful about updating the software or the plugin or whatever, just, you know, and having the session with the client you're working with be the very first time you're seeing if that plugin works like it did yesterday, because things do change.
Indeed.
Well, very cool. Let's jump in and talk a little bit more about where you are now. You are joining us from Engine Room, from your control room?
Today, I am at my home studio.
Okay, cool.
Every other engineer on the face of the planet, I have a workstation set up at home, and everything I do at Engine Room ends up getting reviewed at home. So it actually gets double mastered, I guess you could say, because I'm in a totally separate environment the next day, listening on fresh ears, with a cup of coffee, hanging out in my underwear, living life.
Nice.
And, you know, hanging out with my cats. You know, after 30 years, I don't need to head and tail edit in Manhattan.
Right.
So having a secondary audio environment to listen to everything is just a benefit for everyone, I think. I can do any last minute changes. Occasionally I will encounter something that, you know, causes me to pick up the phone and have one of the assistants at Engine Room go over my notes, and I can just sit there on the phone with them and say, okay, do this, do that, do that. Did you do this? Did you compare it to the old? Did it match? I'm a big fan of subtraction, where you take two versions of the same mix, lock them in sample accurate time, and flip the phase of one of them.
And you should hear
nothing.
Exactly. Less is more in that case, for sure.
Yeah, and in the analog world, you know, there is going to be some minor variation, but if you're hearing lots of kick drum or lots of low end, you know something's wrong.
Yeah, let me clarify that for a sec for the rock stars. So
certainly,
what Andy's talking about is that when you flip the phase on them, you're literally mathematically canceling one version of the mix, or excuse me, one file against the other. And Andy's talking about two matched files. So if this is meant to be the exact same thing as each other, then flipping the phase would cancel it. If there's slight changes between the two, then flipping the phase would actually reveal what those changes were, kind of, sort of, right?
Yes. And a lot of times someone will say, the vocal's too low on this mix, I'm going to send you a vocal up mix. And they end up doing a recall. When it comes in, if you do this comparison, the only thing you should hear is vocal.
And only the amount of vocal that was turned up, right?
Correct. You will hear, you know, reverbs can be kind of random.
Yeah.
Flangers, choruses. But if you're hearing the snare, you know that the snare changed on their end when they did the recall.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, because that might be something that a lot of people would scratch their heads about. So there are a lot of plugins that get used. I know I just went straight to plugins, but this is the world we live in. That get used on mixes that have moving effects, and they might do it differently every time unless you printed that track. So in those cases, yeah, you might take two, quote, identical mixes and flip them and still hear stuff in there, but that not actually be a problem.
Yes.
Okay, cool. Can you describe to us, let's keep talking about your studio for just a sec. Describe what goes into a mastering studio like Engine Room and your home studio. What are you surrounded by?
My home studio is strictly plugs and a set of Meyer HD1s. I've been listening to Meyer HD1s since 1986. So I can pretty much take them with me anywhere and hear and do good billable work. When I first started at Engine Room, although I had checked out the monitors, I brought my Meyers in for probably 3-4 months before I was confident enough that I'd no longer needed them. I have UAD and a whole bunch of iLoks and a whole bunch of plugins, and those travel with me to and from Engine Room because plugins are not evil. It does not have to be I'm an analog guy versus a digital guy. Personally, I like whatever wins the shootout.
Right. Whatever sounds best.
Yes. And working at Engine Room allows me to create these custom hybrid signal paths. I can't say that I always use the analog, but analog is an awesome option to have at your fingertips.
Well, I think I said this already since we started the podcast, but I'll say it again. The stuff that you sent for us to listen to sure sounds good. So whatever you're doing is a great combination.
Well, I would like someone to, send me an email and say, I can tell that this song, and this song were 100% in plugins. This song, and this song are purely analog. I bet you can't because, plugins today, anyone who's got a UAD knows that, wow, that's some pretty good sounding stuff. Yeah. But it doesn't always win the shootout. So the more options you have, the more toys you have, the better. And so the other things that drew me to Engine Room were they have a TubeTech multiband, which is a tube unit. Mm-hmm. And it's, way different than any digital multiband you're ever going to find out there. I like the Maslick EQ. I like the Manley Varimu. And on days I will spend hours switching back and forth between the plugin and the hardware unit. And some days the plugin wins. Some days the analog wins. I think it's all, how good are the tubes feeling that day?
Oh, fascinating. I think the reminder and the takeaway there too is that they're I don't know if absolute is the right word, but there kind of is an absolute takeaway as far as what's better. And it's the human ear. It's always the thing that will tell you. If you can train yourself, if you can really learn how to listen, you will be able to, in any moment, choose which one sounds better. I don't know if you feel like we need to go into some of the things that will fool you as far as what sounds better. Do you want to address any of those topics?
I don't know if I actively know. I know that, having things, learning how to do a real double-blind A/B test is essential. If you can't do a real double-blind A/B test, there could be some variable in there that is swaying your judgment. And of course, the biggest one is level. If you have even a half dB of level on one example compared to the other, as long as there's no negative artifacts like distortion, your ear is always going to pick the louder one. Yes, I like that one. I spent in the early digital days, I was working on a project, just cutting together a flat master for Bob Ludwig with Hugh Padgham. And the label had sent a version of one of the songs, and they said, we heard this version of the mix, and we just like it better. And so here I am with the guy that had mixed it, and we are listening back and forth to his mix off of his DAT tape and the version that's coming back from the label. And it probably took us over an hour, and we're listening and going, first time through, you're thinking, wow, the bottom just sounds a little more full on this version than the other version. Let's listen again. And we go back, oh yeah, but the top is also more open and more, grabs your attention better. Yeah, I kind of like it. And, third time through, the vocal is really more present on this version than the original mix. Why is that? And eventually we just figured that it had gone through an analog board and the level got bumped up like a dB. So not so much that you said, well, that one's just louder.
Right.
It was, but enough that it grabbed your ear and you just liked it.
So is there a process that we should be aware of avoiding that mismatch of levels? Is there some technique?
I am always, now that we all have very exact digital meters in our workstations, there really is no reason to not make sure that things you're comparing are not level matched to a tenth of a dB. And you've got the display right there. Mm-hmm. Why not make sure it's right? And then, and a lot of times, I am to this day still fooled as I am creating multiple versions. Generally when I'm mastering, running down a track, I'm going to try it through my 8 to 10 favorite compressors. And the ones that grab my ear, I'm going to print versions of, but I am going to make sure they are level matched. But sometimes as I'm just doing my initial rundown, the one that seems to be the clear and obvious winner loses once it is 100% level matched to the best of my ability. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And that's something that I feel like I've heard at times, and one of those really eye-opening, ear-opening experiences when you think you had gotten it sounding better, and then you do level match and you listen back and you're like, oh, this doesn't sound better. We might talk about that here more in the second half, and we'll get into things. We'll get into some discussions about the loudness wars and mastering for iTunes and streaming and stuff like that, and how that stuff applies. But let's take a break for just a quick sec. Rockstars, a reminder that we have links to what we're talking about in the show notes. Make sure to go check out the YouTube playlist with all the songs that Andy sent me. They sound great, fantastic. If you're listening to this on YouTube right now, hit that subscribe button and notification bell too, so you can catch more podcast episodes from us. And we'll see you guys in just a minute for the jam session. Are you using a Mac in your recording studio? Are you tired of feeling like the studio setup you worked so hard to create is becoming obsolete too quickly? Wouldn't it feel great to have a trusted friend to help you keep your existing Mac and studio setup current and relevant so that you can focus on the thing you love most, which is making great music? Well, now you can rely on OWC, Otherworld Computing, which you can find at OWC.com, whose mission it is to help you get the most mileage out of your existing Mac. Whether you need to upgrade your RAM, install an SSD drive, add more connectivity, or simply find a great used Mac that's ready to rock, OWC will help take your studio far into the future with a vast library of DIY install videos, 24/7 friendly support, and free shipping in the US on most items over $49. Why get frustrated and ditch your existing computer when you can take your studio far into the future with OWC? Learn more at OWC.com and find out how awesome your Mac can be at OWC. If you want to capture every nuance of a great performance in your studio, then you need to start with a microphone that is crafted with great care and attention to detail. JZ Mics in Riga, Latvia designs amazing sounding microphones that are handcrafted with jeweler's precision to bring you incredible detail in your recordings. At the heart of JZ microphones is the unique Golden Drop capsule design, which uses a lighter, faster diaphragm that delivers great clarity and fidelity while avoiding distracting colorations and distortions. Make sure to check out the Vintage Series V67 and V11 with Class A discrete amplifier circuitry, extremely low self-noise, and advanced built-in shock mount technology to bring a classic, expensive vintage sound to your studio for an affordable price. JZ offers a 5-year warranty, free shipping to the US, and a 30-day money-back guarantee. Plus, for a limited time, you can use the coupon code ROCKSTAR to get 50% off their Vintage Series microphones. I got one. You're hearing my voice right now on the V67. Wouldn't it feel great to have one of these in your studio? Go to jzmic.com or click the link in the show notes below. Hey Rockstars, we're back now for the jam session. My guest today is Andy Vandette, joining us from New York from his home studio, mastering great records. We're going to talk more about that. You ready to jam, Andy?
Hell yeah.
All right, dude. You were describing your home studio setup. You're talking about your monitors. You were also talking about engine room audio. What about the monitoring that you would work on at engine room? Is it sort of like something bigger and fancier than what we have in our home listening environments?
Oh, yes. They have a custom set of Griffin monitors designed for the room that they live in. A bi-amped setup, dual 15-inch woofers, and then satellites that sit up above. Yeah, great imaging. You know, when I went there, when I was looking for a new home, I sat down with my stack of favorite CDs and said, yeah, you know, I could do work here now.
Nice.
It was a little more, when it actually came time to actually do it, I did count on my crutch, my HD ones, to verify that what I was hearing was what I was hearing.
Yeah. Let's see. What do I want to ask you about? The Griffin monitors, the dual woofers. First of all, what is the experience if it's a great system and you're saying, yes, this works for me? What kind of things might you be listening for?
I guess the full range. Some speakers, have a tighter bottom, but I need to know what is down in that 20 to 40 hertz range. If you have a lot of the mixes I receive, the mix engineer obviously didn't have any sense whatsoever of what was going on between 20 and 40, the bottom octave. And if you use too much of your energy misfocused, you're never going to be able to get the punch out of the kick drum that you're going to want. And it's going to bottom out systems when you crank it up. That's going to start making the woofer belch and try to fly across the room way too early. People mix on these Yamaha NS10s. Maybe you've heard of them.
I might be looking at a pair right now.
And, you know, so if you're mixing on Yamaha NS10s, you've got some voodoo in you that I do not have, because they do not have an accurate low end. And it's really easy, if you're not experienced, to misfocus your low frequencies. You know, I have an audio mentor. I feel like my mastering experience is just this narrow vision, this small slice of the grand audio world. And so when things don't fit in to my audio world, I go to a guy named Paul Special, who comes from the same hometown as I do, and he was the only person I knew in New York when I first got here. And he came up the ranks through the Record Plant Studios as I was coming up the ranks at Masterdisk. And so whenever I have, his experience in the audio industry is vast compared to my own. He currently does the on-air mix for Good Morning America for their musical guests.
Nice.
As well as, you know, he recorded a Jeff Beck Les Paul tribute record that won a Grammy. He's just all over the place. Everything that I don't know, Paul knows. And so I go to him.
He's got a cool name, Paul Special. You kidding?
Yeah. So I go to Paul and I say, Paul, how is it that you can go into any studio in New York and get a great mix on Yamaha NS10s. How does that work? Because, I am 99% in the same audio space that I know like the back of my hand. And if I was to walk into some other mastering guy's room, chances are I'm going to be struggling for a bit. Mm-hmm. And he goes, well, I've learned that you can't count on the sound, but I've learned what good low end feels like. I put my hand on the cone. Mm-hmm. And wow, what a great idea! I never would have thought of that.
I remember seeing Tom Lord Alge do that when we were mixing.
Oh, yeah?
I know I name drop him a lot on the show, but he's the first person I watched reach up and put his hand on the speakers on NS10s. And then I started doing that, and now it's just like force of habit. I'm putting my hand and my knee on the car door to feel the low end. I go and put my hand on the back wall. It's just, I don't know, I can't describe what I'm doing with it, but it's like a process of being in touch with the sound on an extra level, I guess.
Whatever works for you, but why not mix on Yamaha NS10s with a sub?
Well, I do have a sub.
Okay.
I do have a sub. And I think the tricky thing, of course, is knowing, well, how to set the sub level so that it's appropriate. And I have, at one point we had smart software in here, and me and my intern were figuring it out, and trying to shoot it out. And sure enough, just even the act of trying to get them to sound better, it all sounded a lot better when we were done. And then more recently, I've been using the SonarWorks Reference 4 software, and that again, these are EQ tricks to try and compensate for what's not quite right with the system. Mm-hmm. But it really is helpful, and it's, for me, when I did that and I put the SonarWorks EQ on there, it just highlighted how messed up my bass and kick were sounding, and made it easier for me to go, oh, I need to correct that.
Yeah.
That's helpful. But anyway, okay, so NS10s don't have a lot of low end. Feeling the low end is helpful. What about, when you're working on your big system there, you talked about dual woofers. Is there any comments you want to make about the importance of dual woofers on a mixed system? Can you have one woofer, and can that still be, or no, you said dual woofers. Did you mean dual subs?
Yeah, dual subs.
Yeah. Is it important to have dual subs? Can you have one sub and that still be helpful?
I would think that from just the theoretical audio aspect of it, that having dual subs is probably a bad idea. But every system I've ever worked on has had that. Yeah.
Well, I know that I've also talked to some great studio designers here, and Carl Tatz is one of them. And he really swears by dual subs, and I've heard his systems, and they sound incredible. So for me, the experience of listening on really high-end monitors is sitting there, and all of a sudden the whole sound and image becomes very three-dimensional, and the low end is sort of feels like your speakers are made out of granite instead of paper,
Yes. I call that seeing God. I turned on the system and I saw God.
Yes.
So, yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, actually, now since you're saying seeing God, and I know you've done a lot of heavy records, let's talk about some of that. Do you have any stories you want to share about, big, loud, heavy rock bands with distorted guitars that were a lot of fun for you to master?
Fun? Well, I do have a lot of records that were a lot of fun, but the fun ones don't stick out in your mind like the ones that maybe weren't so fun. And I'll share one of those really quick. I had the opportunity to work with a mega producer that a couple of my clients had been trying to match me up with forever. And so here I finally got the opportunity to work with this mega producer. They needed the single ahead of time, which is, like I was talking about, great. I get to feel out how they like their music mastered. And the single was mastered and approved and was done. But the day that he showed up for the attended mastering session, he said, Andy, every time a kid comes up to me and says, "Hey, you got to hear this. This is awesome. You must hear this." They're going to play it for me on Apple earbuds or a laptop speaker. So I want to make this record sound full range coming from a laptop or earbuds.
Wow.
And I said, okay. So I switched off my big monitors and mastered the record on Yamaha NS10s and laptop speakers. And the results of which I cannot listen to in my car because it's just, I could, readjust the entire settings, but just being able to go from CD to CD or playlist to playlist, it just comes on. It could never be played in a club. And it was a very guitar-oriented rock record. Mm-hmm. So, pre-emphasizing that much low end onto a signal or onto a mix is just not the best idea. Now, I did have the luck to get matched up with Stephen Wilson of Porcupine Tree, and he came in with a big stack of analog tape, and I got to put up the track called Blackest Eyes, which is on the playlist. And I hit play, and in my mind, I was like, oh, today is going to be a good day. Today is going to be one of those days where I get to choose what dB on what equalizer I am going to use. Tim Palmer is just an incredible mix engineer, and we worked our way through the record. And it still is one of my favorite records of all time. I hear the opening of Blackest Eyes, and really, I still get like shivers down my spine. It's just a wonderful rock moment.
Yeah, that record sounds great.
That record, I like to talk about that record because that record is the way records used to be made. The band gets signed to a big label. They get to record it in a name studio with a name engineer. It gets mixed. And the players, of course, are great. And then it gets mixed by a real mix guy and sent on to a mastering guy like me. Compared to the next record from Porcupine Tree, which one is that? That one was Deadwing. And, Deadwing is the way records are made now, where the guitarist, who's, is definitely no slouch, Steven's great, but, recorded himself, felt that he wasn't getting mixes as good at the big name studio as he was at home. So he ended up mixing it himself. And at that time I said, well, if you're going to mix it yourself and you're going to mix it in the box, then the way we should do it is get an analog summing amp, break it out into various subgroups, and then stick it through a nice analog summing amp to mush it all to stereo. Mm-hmm. And he said, that sounds great. I'll send you my Mac. Make sure it all works when I get there. We did do a day of just open up the door to tweaking the mixes in mastering. And some of the kick drums had been layered very thick. Mm-hmm. And while I wanted it to be its own musical moment and its own sound for its own album, I knew that sooner or later people were going to compare it to the previous record. And so as soon as I did that, I was thinking, wow, this needs to be addressed. And because Stephen was there and we got to work through it all, I think it came out great. And he said that the changes that we made to the stereo mix held true for the surround mixes as well.
Nice. Well, I'm listening to you talk about, mixing in different environments, mastering. You talked about the kind of the failure of trying to master for laptop speakers and earbuds specifically, without consideration of what it should sound like on the big monitors. And I feel like that addresses or brings up the question of, how do we consider a big sound system, a car, laptop speakers, earbuds? When I listened to your YouTube playlist, it sounds great to me in the studio on the NS10s with the subwoofer, It sounds great on my Bose speakers, computer speakers up in my office. It sounds great playing off the speaker on my iPhone. Why is that? And, what is the act of trying to find the balance that makes all those things come together like that?
And, it's really a best fit thing. Although it sounds acceptable on earbuds, I don't believe that any audiophile listens to music on earbuds and expects to get the sense of enjoyment out of it. In fact, I don't know of any audiophiles that listen on earbuds. They've all, replaced them with something better than what came with their iPhone.
Right.
So I don't master for earbuds. That is an exercise in futility.
Okay.
And things that sound good on earbuds, I think, are less likely to sound good in the other, 75% of audio environments that you're going to hear things at. If it sounds good on earbuds, it's kind of by chance. And because, I have enough experience listening on other environments to not make it too extreme in any one area or the other.
Yeah. So it really is a balancing act.
I would say so.
One of the things that really irritates me when I'm mixing is taking a mix that I thought was pretty good and I was feeling good about the low end, and then I go turn it up in the car, and somehow it's kind of there, but it kind of just distorts the whole car stereo, or I hear this sort of fluttering distortion on the vocal that's being caused by the bass and the kick drum in the low end. Is there any insight into, is there any universal insight into what causes that to happen? Or is that just, just keep working on it, Lidge, till you get it better and better?
The whole car thing is, what's the difference between any audio environment and a professional audio environment? Well, professional audio environments show us that good mixes sound good and bad mixes sound bad. Right. The car is kind of a little of both, but not entirely one or the other. So I can't tell you the number of times that I have listened in my car, because I listen a lot in my car, and I accept it as a valid audio environment, but can sometimes be misleading because it is not a professional audio environment. Sometimes it will make mastering that I'm going to hear again in the studio and go, I need to fix that. How did I not hear that in the car? That's amazing. Or the other way, I'll freak out by what I hear in the car, only to go back to the studio and, it's going to cause me to listen to it 3 other places to verify that, no, this is what I would call a car anomaly.
Well, now, is it a fair perspective to say, okay, I'm going to go listen to some other records off of my iPhone in the car, and those don't seem to have the problem that mine does, and to conclude that mine still has a problem? That's reasonable, isn't it?
It is reasonable. I would want to listen, if I felt that I had a problem with a mix by listening in the car, I would want to reconfirm it at the studio and a couple other places to make sure that, okay, out of the 4 environments I've heard it in, the only one that sucks is the car.
Right.
So that is a car anomaly. But if you start saying, wow, I didn't really hear that in my studio monitors, but I hear it in the car, I hear it on my friend's system, and I hear it on my home stereo, then you know that it's your mix.
Are there any universal low frequency ranges that seem to get amplified in the car that we might miss in the studio? Or is that, unique for every studio car environment?
I'd say, depends on the car system. Some car systems have subs. Some do not. I've had a whole bunch of different cars over the year. And I really liked my GM Delco stock system because it had the God switch, that loudness control that, and I knew that with it in, that I would wish that it had a hair less top and bottom because it had pushed it a little too hard. And with it out, I should want a little bit more. The next car I had was a Subaru. And when I heard the stock system, I said, well, that's fine. I can always replace it. And I'm a mastering engineer. I should be able to learn how to voice mixes for any system, right? Well, I did end up piece by piece replacing it, and it just never became an environment that I could trust. And then the next car was, again, a Subaru, and I made the salesman, sit there in the car with me and listen to 10 different CDs to make sure that I didn't want to, upgrade. Yeah. It had a really nice sound system, but there was like some Harman Kardon system that I could have bought a car with that in it, and I didn't feel it was necessary.
It's funny, the car salesman's like, don't you want to take it for a test drive? You're like, drive it? I'm just going to park it in the parking lot and listen to records on it. What are you talking about?
That's what I did, yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the online aspect of music. Mastered for iTunes, and then next question will be about YouTube, and why does your playlist sound great when I play it on YouTube back? When, people might be inclined to say, oh, YouTube's not a good place to go listen to music. What is Mastered for iTunes? Let's start there.
Oh, Mastered for iTunes I think, really took Apple by surprise. Because, they thought that their encoding algorithm to get it to an AAC was transparent. They had done focus groups, and they had done, they had sent out versions to mastering engineers and asked them to do double-blind tests. And when the Apple representative came to the studio and said, we have yet to have a mastering engineer be willing to do an actual double-blind test and pick out the AAC. I don't know if I believe him or not. But it was basically, from my aspect, I had just started doing the Rush catalog, and I knew that they were going to be releasing it on iTunes for the first time. And I had seen Vlado Meller was working on a Red Hot Chili Peppers record. And Rick Rubin had called him up and said, these files don't sound anything like my record. Please send Apple something to make the files that are going to be sold to the end consumer sound like my record. And so Vlado's assistant worked very hard. It was a pain in the ass. They had not yet released their toolkit. So in order for a common mortal like us to create an AAC with using the same algorithm that they were going to use, it was all command line driven programming through terminal. And so, of course, if one character in this long string of characters was incorrect, the whole thing was going to crash. And first you needed to convert it to an Apple lossless file and then to an AAC file. And so I was lucky enough to be able to just, steal that whole technique. And yeah, that encoder was very peculiar. Like from track to track, the nuances that would change weren't always the same.
So terminal is that scary window that pops up on my Mac and makes me think somebody just hacked my computer?
Yes, okay. Indeed.
All right.
The way computers used to be when I was a kid.
Yeah. When you'd press the return key and a bunch of text would fly up the screen.
Yes.
And it was also green on a black background.
Yes.
Okay, cool. So you're saying that the Mastered for iTunes has a lot to do with getting that WAV file into an AAC file and sounding right.
Yeah, fooling their encoder into sounding more like the CD.
Okay.
Now, beyond that, it all becomes a budgetary consideration, because in a perfect world, guys like me would be able to master for every format imaginable. to create an entirely different mastering for the vinyl version, to create a different mastering for the CD than is what is going to be released on streaming and what is going to be sold on iTunes.
That's kind of answering that question we were talking about earlier about having it sound good on earbuds or a laptop or stereo or car or, in the mastering room.
Well, you don't really know what format is going to end up on what system. I mean, I don't think you're going to end up hearing vinyl on earbuds, but you could.
No, but I mean, I think it's likely that you're going to hear an AAC file or some kind of MP3 on the iPhone, on the earbuds, on the iPhone speaker, and through the car stereos at streaming through Bluetooth.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So how much time can you spend creating different versions for every format that's going to be released?
Dude, we've got home studios. We got our whole life.
But if that involves going back to the analog master, in a Manhattan studio,
okay,
time is expensive.
Maybe not then.
I am still learning about the pluses and minuses of creating something specifically for streaming, and even streaming services do it all different themselves.
Mm-hmm.
So, going with the attitude of garbage in, garbage out. So starting with something that sounds really good. I don't think I have ever been the guy that was the loudest out there. I like things a good contemporary type loud.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but but listening again to your YouTube playlist that you sent, I was struck by how every single track felt just right loud on there, and not too quiet and not like pumped up like it sounded, overhyped or anything like that. It really sounded hi-fi streaming it off of YouTube, and I thought I was struck by that.
Generally, if something of mine sounds too loud, overhyped, bit crunchy, it's because that's what my client asked for.
Right. Or maybe that's where it came from. Now, that does make me want to go to the question, what are things that you can really do magic to in mastering, and what are the things that you simply can't fix because of the recording or mix?
Good question. I try to tell my people that I have lots of processors that can add a nice sense of air, that can de-ess, even if I end up having to, say, go in and spectrally edit 4 or 5 strong sibilant S's within a song, or 20, because a de-esser is just going to grab the hi-hat or the snare too much.
Yeah.
What I don't have is something that's going to compensate for getting the balance between the kick and the bass instrument. If you make your bass instrument too heavy in the sub and your kick either too low in level, or it just doesn't have enough what I call poke, there's a good chance that I'm not going to be able to reach in with some kind of magical digital plugin and get the kind of kick sound out of it that I am looking for. Even if, dynamic cues, I've tried everything. And when you do encounter a mix like that, there's a whole range of plugins that I call forbidden jitsu plugins, or forbidden jitsu mastering. I call them the transient enhancers, even like aural enhancers, the brighteners. If you get into those, they're kind of like audio crack. Once you hear it, you're like, I'm gonna use this. In fact, why don't I use it on everything? I can stop whenever I want. And so you really have to be sure that that's what you want. And chances are, when you find something you like, use less, turn it down a little bit more than you think you should. They do have some downside.
It's kind of like put it up to the level you're like, that's good, and then turn it one click down.
Yes.
It's not a bad strategy.
Not a bad strategy at all, especially since at the beginning of the program, less is more. And why do I get gigs and lose gigs? Because I overprocess. So, yes.
We don't have to go into this, but my brain is taking me to the question of, does that apply to performance as well? I don't know. That's another podcast episode. Okay, so that's fascinating to hear, because obviously as a mixer, working really hard to try and get that the bass and the kick and the low end to all go together, and that's where the power of a rock record particularly is. Or a pop song, that's where you want to feel it when you turn it up. That's where you want it to be crankable in the car. And I might work really hard on that, but there still might be elements where I'm like, man, I got it to where I could get it. I sure hope that he can make it, take it, turn on the awesome button at mastering. And I would suggest that on some level, just the things that you might do by sculpting some of the low end EQ and limiting or bringing up the level of stuff, especially when I was mixing before we all had loudness plugins in our DAWs, and just you already are able to make things way too loud when you're mixing. Those are places where I might have gotten it back from you and just been like, oh, thank God, there's the God button. So I'm going to throw that back at you and suggest that you do have a God button, and maybe you're being humble about it.
I only have what everybody else has. Because I am using a digital limiter at the end of a chain. But I have a superior monitoring environment where I can tell that a boost at 40 hertz versus a boost at 50 hertz or 60 hertz, I can tell the difference.
Mm-hmm.
And, I totally understand that mix guys are under tremendous pressure to give the client something at CD level. I had a guy, someone that I had worked with doing editing work for Howie Weinberg, call me up. His name, I don't know, maybe you've heard of him. His name's Andy Wallace.
Okay,
So like 20 years ago, Andy Wallace called me. I don't know, maybe he was embarrassed to call Howie and ask the question, these fucking A&R guys, they get my mixes and they say, Andy, you got to do a recall. I was just comparing this to, this CD, and it sucks. And I tell them, no, that's a great mix. I don't want to change that. Wait until you hear it mastered. Then you're gonna hear the true greatness. No, man, you got to do a recall. This blows. And so he was like, Andy, what can I do? And so I pointed him in the direction of some of the boxes, the Make It Louder boxes and the Make It Louder plugins, strictly for client copies.
Mm-hmm.
And then you send the mastering guy something else. And when I get Chris Lord Algae mix, people tend to be critical on him and on his compression. I think his mixes sound great, and every mix I get from him hits like -6. He's done an awesome mix, and he has left it up to the mastering engineer to decide the best way to make it an appropriate loud. That's exactly what I want. If you send me a mix and it already has an L1, L2, L3, your whatever you're mixing through to estimate what I'm going to do to it, chances are, you have limited my options greatly. I like to do rides and things, and when you do rides, and the level goes up and it's already bashing the top of the digital scale, well, that kind of makes the hair on the back of my neck stand up, because I know that really things should only be peak limited once. After that, they become what I call digitally fragile. Nice. And suddenly, a half dB of EQ, it sounds like 2 dB before peak limiting.
Fascinating. Also, you mentioned doing rides. Can you describe what that means in a mastering context?
Oh, you see, did I put it on my playlist? Down on my playlist at the bottom in the should have been huge section, is a song by Tony C and the Truth called A Little Bit More. And that song came in and it sounded very linear. It had been compressed already, and the choruses just didn't pop. So that is a comp of two separate passes, and the choruses come from a pass that's just 2 dB hotter. So, bam, the downbeat of the chorus happens, and, it pops up. And then at the end of the chorus, it goes back down. So, wherever, sometimes going into a chorus, if you've already stereo bus limited your mix, if it doesn't pop enough, I'm going to make it pop.
Interesting. Cool.
I might even ride down the second half of the verse before that occurs. And, sometimes I can do it all by hand, and sometimes it requires comping. Same thing with low end, like the verses, sound great, but then when it gets into the chorus, either the low end is either in the way or not present enough. Mm-hmm. So, we've got these knobs. Why not twist them?
That's so great. I love to hear that, because it just makes me smile to know that at the mastering stage, you would have the same creative investment that you might if you were mixing it. You're in there. You're not just trying to find one little bit of something, but it's like, man, if this song needs something here, let's figure out how to do it so that the vision comes through.
Right. And if you've already maxed out your level and is already, bashing the top of the digital scale, I always say, you should only peak limit one time. Re-squaring the square waves is never a good idea. There's always going to be some kind of artifacting there, whether you're conscious of it or not.
This show is sponsored by Recording Studio Rockstars Academy. Are you ready to take your recording, mixing, and mastering to the next level and make your best record ever? Then visit the Academy to find the course that's right for you. Want to record killer drums in your home studio? Then check out Rockstars of Drums to learn how to record, edit, and mix pro-sounding drums with a professional Nashville session drummer in a Grammy-winning studio. Or if you are ready to start mastering your own records at home, then check out Rockstars of Mastering, where I walk you through exactly how I mastered my own record, Skadoosh, using nothing but plugins in PreSonus Studio One. These techniques would work for you in whichever DAW you are using right now. And if mixing is your focus, then check out my free course, Mix Master Bundle, where I show you how to mix using stock and free plugins in Pro Tools. Plus, you get a look at how I recorded everything in my studio and multi-track downloads to mix in your own studio, and even include in your mixing portfolio if you want. Are you ready to make your best record ever? Then go to mixmasterbundle.com to get started for free now, and look for the clickable link in the show notes of this episode. So let me talk for just a moment about how I've recently been mixing, where I basically built my mix in Pro Tools, and then it all feeds a mix bus, and then that mix bus feeds sort of a quiet output level at that level, and then it goes through a secondary hot output level, so that, whether it's right or wrong, I found myself wanting to listen to the hotter one while I was working. Mm-hmm. But that's the one that runs the risk of it has limiting on it. I'm not intentionally trying to see any lights on the meter, on the limiter, but it's, it's probably catching some of those peaks. But it's also, when I print the quieter version and the limited version. Do you think that is an approach that might help, many of the rock stars listening to this as they want to figure out how to get their mix right and deliver it to mastering? Or am I only getting part of the equation there?
No, I think you've got it very good. My problem are the guys that I suggest to them that they send me a mix without the extra level, and they complain. Oh, no, that's an integral part of my sound. Really? Okay, well, if you think you're the master of L1, I can't really argue with you. You've made the decision that it's going to be on there. But chances are I have something that can beat it. But in order for me to even investigate that, I have to have a version with yours off. If it turns out that you give me both and you turn out to be the god of L1, I'll use it. I don't really have a problem. Like I said before, I'm all about what wins the shootout. And if I, in my blind A/B test, keep picking the version I created with all that extra sauce on it, I have no problem. It doesn't happen often.
Well, also the extra sauce that the artist is mixing with, which gives the music the right kind of character or whatever. You may just have a better way to do that, which I think is what you're saying. And so you may need to back up one step with the quieter version and work it with your tools to give it that character, but with more goodness, I guess is a way to say it. I like to think of that also. I don't know if this is a totally fair analogy, but I think of that like an electric guitar and a guitar amp. An electric guitar direct signal coming out without a guitar amp may not make a whole lot of sense by itself. But if you pick a better amp than the other, you're really going to appreciate that. You're going to notice it. But you can't take the first guitar amp version and run it through the second guitar amp and get that. You got to go back to the guitar signal, one step. It's a little bit of an extreme analogy, but
I think it's probably one of the better analogies of why not to send peak limited mixes for mastering.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you very much. Let's talk a little bit more about getting records to, avoid sounding harsh. So, a question I wrote down was how can we make loud in-your-face records that are still somehow smooth and not harsh? I think that's at the core of what you've been talking about already. But you've done a lot of great sounding rock records where they're like, it's the energy is loud, but the frequencies aren't tiring my ear.
Well, thank you. And how do I do that?
Yeah, sure. How do you do that, Andy?
Well, it shouldn't hurt my ear either. And, sometimes it does require some de-essing. A lot of times people get the track right, but they've just made the vocal too sibilant. And it's, I try to brighten up the track a hair to get a little more crack out of the snare and end up taking people's ears out or making ears bleed with the S's. And, spectral editing has been incredible. I can't really say that I use a de-esser so much anymore. Going in and being able to see, there's that S, and I can spectrally edit the S and make it end right before the crack of the snare. So it has no effect on the snare whatsoever.
That's cool. For me, spectral editing means RX, isotope RX. Are there other tools out there as well that get used for that sort of thing? Well,
there's a spectral editor built right into my main digital audio workstation, which is Sequoia.
Right on. Sequoia. I've been hearing more about Sequoia, so I'm intrigued, very intrigued.
Everything has its pluses and minuses. I would love a world where I only needed one workstation, but it is not my sole workstation. And if I only had one workstation, I probably wouldn't be Sequoia. But the spectral editing feature built into it is one of the main reasons it is my final cut and chop workstation.
Right on. Yeah, in fact, it was Tim Dolbear who was just on the show before you, who was talking about working in Sequoia. Mm-hmm. Very cool. All right. So, and spectral editing gives you this beautiful, beautiful visual sort of cascading look on the screen. It just looks cool to begin with, and you can see sounds, and it's really remarkable. I sort of remember when, I don't know if it was the introduction of spectral editing or if it was when it sort of came across the blogosphere as like, here's this new fun tool. And it was like, take a Van Gogh painting and load it into this thing and it'll spit out sound, in reverse, which was never very useful. But actually spectral editing is really cool. And I know if I do stuff like that in Isotope, you use tools that look familiar to you for graphic editing, like lasso tools and boxes and stuff like that. Do you have even better tools than that? Do you use paintbrushes and things like that to adjust spectral editing?
No, I would say boxes, lassos, yes.
Okay, cool. Well, groovy. Well, I'm going to explore even more. I've mentioned this, I think recently, but Larry Crane had a great tip when he was on the podcast, Larry Crane of Tape Op. He talked about using spectral editing to, port over like a guitar track, and he'd put it over there, and then he'd sort of spectral edit out certain resonant frequencies in that guitar if he wanted to, and send it back. A buzz would be an obvious one, but being able to do that even for just tones that seemed to feedback that was sustaining and it just sort of seemed to have the wrong fundamental, you could just go adjust it a little and bring it back. I thought that was kind of cool.
Yeah, no, that sounds really cool. I'm always intrigued with what the next version of something like Sony spectral layers will be able to do. I don't really think it's quite there yet, but if in mastering I could truly extract a kick drum track and roll off the sub that's on the bass guitar and then add back the natural, kick that actually sounded fine, could be a potential fix in the future for, one of my biggest mastering problems. But
you sure you want to let everybody know about that?
Hey, if someone can show me how they can actually make that work, I have not, in theory it should, but in actuality it hasn't worked that well.
Right. I mean, there are remarkable tools like Melodyne, for example, that I use regularly in the studio. And they do pretty fantastic things, but sometimes, what I hope might work doesn't quite work to my ear the way it theoretically should.
Yes.
So I understand what you're saying. Let me ask you about mastering a couple of the jazz records that I put in the playlist. So Brian Blade and Adam Holzman, both very cool sounding records, different from each other too. And I wondered if you wanted to talk about stuff you've learned about mastering for jazz, in the context of mastering these rock records and stuff like that. Are there similarities in mastering projects like that, or are there bigger differences?
To me, I see bigger differences, especially the Brian Blade record is just, to me, such a traditional jazz record, a jazz purist record, where I was totally not at all worried about level. It is not a record that should be involved in the loudness wars.
Right.
The extreme dynamics, I am not worried at all if a listener has to adjust the volume control while driving in their car at 70 miles an hour. That's not a concern. It should be as open and dynamic as humanly possible. Whereas,
that song in the playlist, which one did I put in there? Is He Died Fighting. Starts out with a very quiet sort of tom build.
Yes,
I thought that must have been a real challenge. Somehow your master of it just. It's very quiet there, but if it was my mix, I would have been like, oh crap, I screwed up the mix. But your version of it sounds like, oh, I can really hear how it's a super quiet tom thing that's building out of nowhere and doesn't have noise on it and sounds cool.
Yeah, no, it was definitely had to restrain myself, because given, the tools you have around you, you want to use them, you want to show change, but the mixes came in and they really sounded good. Yeah. And so it was really just a matter of giving a great ultra dynamic transfer from the analog masters.
How do you know how loud is loud enough for something like that?
I have in my mind and on meters what I would call a level window. And on a pop or a rock, you kind of know, okay, this is my soft kind of loud, and this is my over-the-top peak kind of loud, and how far apart they can be and should be. And in that world, I have to say, I have a mastering Achilles heel that I am contacted by clients, and they say, oh, yeah, we love the record. Everything sounds great. But that quiet song is too loud. And even though I know that I have this issue recurring, and I'm trying to, while I'm mastering it the first time, hey, Andy, this could be one of those moments. Let's make sure we don't make the quiet song too loud. And then I get that call, and it's like, don't. Oh, crap. Oh, crap. Well, turning things down, that's easy. So, on a scale of problems, it's not that big of a problem. But on a jazz record like the Brian Blade, I am looking at the peaks, and the peaks are all going to be in the top range of that level window. But I'm not going to be nearly as conscious or controlling about the bottom edge of that level window.
Right.
Things can just
if they want to go down and get quiet,
right?
And that's fine. If it's musical, that's fine. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very cool. Are you a big jazz fan yourself?
I was raised a classically trained musician. I had to play trombone through my Fredonia college experience. Everyone in my family is classically trained musician. My brother was a member of the Buffalo Opera Company before they went bankrupt. So, I have an appreciation for it. I would probably say the more contemporary forms. To me, there's a few different camps of jazz. The camp that sounds like three people in three different rooms warming up before a performance. The kind of randomness, and then it all falls together for a little bit, and then that's not the kind of jazz that I am going to be putting on too often. The stuff that smooth jazz, I like smooth jazz.
On a Sunday morning?
On a Sunday morning, yeah. It has its place, and I'm always intrigued with musicality and alternate meters. But I think at the end of the day, I'm more of a rock guy.
Nice. I get, the question that popped in my head when you're talking about being classically trained again was wondering whether your ability to read music and sheet music has ever entered the mastering room. But I imagine with rock, it probably is never going to happen.
Well, yeah, if and when I get classical recordings, there is more comping going on in a classical recording than a pop vocal track. Sometimes multiple edits per bar, because they know that although it was all done live to two, that comping together a most perfect performance can be the difference between being booked the next 10 New Year's Eves or sitting home. So, there's a lot of pressure in that environment to have things sound as slick and perfect as any genre of music.
That's interesting. I'd heard that about the classical world, that like nobody's more demanding about comping than classical musicians,
Mm-hmm.
Which is interesting.
I think in 35 years, I've actually had to read music twice.
Okay.
As far as the master.
There you go. All right. So rock stars, you don't necessarily need to learn how to read music if you want to make rock records. Master anyway.
Yeah. Well, it's good if you can count to four. That's true.
Yeah, that helps. If you want to know where the one is, the downbeat is important.
Now that everything is performed to a click, things have gotten significantly easier. I can remember doing edits, trying to do radio edits with stuff that wasn't performed to a click, or let's say I used to do a lot of clean edits and radio edits, taking out offensive words from hip hop tracks, and having to in the days before labels wised up and said, "You're not getting paid unless you give us an instrumental along with the main mix." Now everyone has an instrumental mix, and you can just take out the offensive word by cutting in a snippet of the instrumental locked in time. But there were, in the early days, Andy searching the loop before the vocal started and the loop after the vocal ended for just whatever didn't have a vocal over it so that I could do the exact same thing as if I had an instrumental. And, those were some of the most challenging edits of my entire life.
Yeah, I can relate. I've searched for bits and pieces in other parts of the song, many times. And
continually relocking that 4-bar non-vocal phrase over and over and over and over again within a single track.
Yeah. Well, Andy, we're coming to the end here, so let me jump forward to these sort of jam session questions and see if we can get through a couple of them really quickly on our way out. When you started out in recording, what do you feel like was holding you back?
Well, I thought a lot about that, and really everyone was incredibly supportive, maybe rather naive getting started, so nothing but myself. I never intended to be a mastering engineer. I always thought I was going to be a, musician, vocalist, engineer, producer in a multi-track room, never in the mastering. And it really took me a while to, get behind that. And nobody is going to help you except for yourself, especially in today's. I started off in what I'd like to call the "if you build it, they will come" market. Right. And, you put together a great room with great gear and a friendly staff, people would come to you. Now, there is no one out there trying to promote my work and the recordings that I am making other than myself, and trying to promote in addition to work is a constant challenge. And so, I kind of wish that I had gotten that God helps those who help themselves memo years earlier in the "if you build it, they will come" years. Because I see those that had more self-promotional skills, get much farther ahead.
Well, we really appreciate you being on the show with us here. And Rockstars, just a reminder and an understanding, this 2 hours that Andy's joined us for this interview is 2 hours he's not mastering a record at the moment. So that is hugely appreciated.
It's great to be here. It's great to have, venues now that we have all lost the opportunity to get what I had, which is, standing in the back of a room behind an industry luminary, trying to comp some of his skills, his workflow, his ethics, his, the whole sense of musicality. The biggest part of my clientele are people who go through recording programs but didn't have that real world internship that I had. And they generally become my most hardcore clientele after an album or two. They know exactly what I want. They've seen the results that can happen. Chances are, the first album, I might have suggested a couple changes because at this point I have my name on enough bad sounding records that, if I find that the album was recorded and doesn't require booking additional studio time at a specific studio with a specific engineer, and it's all on the guitarist's hard drive, it makes it real easy to feel out clients and say, I hear a lot of good stuff going on, but why is the vocal so much brighter than the snare? Or why is the snare so much brighter than the vocal? There's usually one or two things that really keep a mix from being listenable.
Yeah, well, there's always the same answer, which is, I didn't know. That's why. I had no idea. Well, that's cool. And I hear that often that, especially in this day and age with people, working from home studios, like you said, and being able to recall a mix and make changes, there's a very, very important feedback loop that can exist between the mastering engineer and the mixer. And that can be part of, backing up a step and getting it right at the source.
It's a good option to have. That being said, I can comment for days on the subject of like balance. But what I find separates the ultra professional from the non-professional in mixing is depth. So when you close your eyes, how deep is that soundstage? Chances are your favorite mixer, it's going to be quite deep. And so, something I'm always intrigued by with you guys is how do you achieve that?
Oh, man, I don't know. I listen to your finished masters and I try and duplicate that.
Well, that's it. I would say listen to everything.
Yeah.
I'm amazed. There are too many bands that are out there. And so when I throw up a mix and I dislike it and my friend Paul Special is around, I'm like, Paul, what do you think of this mix? And he'll be like, that's really interesting. It kind of reminds me of, the second Pixies album with a little bit of Bob Dylan mixed in.
Nice.
What? Oh, okay. I guess I have to go back and listen some more to find the good.
How about sharing with the rock stars a recording tip, hack, or secret sauce, something that would help them on their next record in their studio?
If they haven't, they should really invest in the Golden Ears ear training CDs.
Oh, yeah.
These are the same recordings that I used. A guy named Dave Moulton was the head of the sound recording department at that small school an hour south of Buffalo. And we would get together every week and do some listening before we booked our studio time. And those helped me so much. Every single day, I use what I learned, and it just is so good to be able to quantify, let your artist go off and speak in all these, weird kind of terms. Oh, I really like the mix, but I wish it could be more green.
Right.
What the fuck do you do with that? It really helps you. Okay, I think what he's talking about is, he wants some more earthy warmth. So that's going to be, like a 250, 300-ish range.
No, did he just want you to hand him a Benjamin?
I have not spoken with David in many years. But I am still, thankful that he made us do this ear training and just listening to everything that is out there.
Yeah. Now, do you think that ear training, for example, it just makes me wonder if stuff like that can even be helpful? Let's say you're listening in your car and you're trying to understand what it's doing better. I
never heard in that environment. So I don't know, but I imagine that yes, it could help you, especially the later trials that aren't just pure frequency.
Right.
That, making sure you're noticing what you're supposed to notice will help you define quantitatively the difference between a professional monitoring environment and your car.
Just out of curiosity, if somebody's going to go check out the Golden Ears and they're going to go listen in their studio, generally speaking, what kind of time investment might somebody be considering for something like that? Are we talking about many, many hours of repeated study?
It probably all depends on how much of that you're getting right.
Okay.
If from the first disc you're finding that it's a struggle, you should spend some time and slow down. Yeah. But I would imagine that most people with a little bit of experience could, advance to some of the later trials that are more challenging.
Awesome. All right. Well, let me jump forward to the business question. What advice do you have for the rock stars about making records as a business if they want to do this for more than just a hobby? Any resources or any tips?
Anything that can help you keep it all logical. The less you have to remember, the better. It is a constant struggle for me. I have 3 different email addresses, and some people choose to communicate with me via Facebook rather than an email. And so when I'm sitting there at midnight and I'm trying to recall, now, did he say a little less bass on the 3rd song or the 4th song? How quickly can I retrieve the right information? So I have taken to creating just an open-ended Word document that has everything. They send me the initial, session information with the track listing. Getting the correct titles out of them is sometimes a struggle because they don't even know what it is, and the file name doesn't match the working title, which doesn't match the final title. So keeping a running, just a big long document in that artist's folders so that you can go back and refer to it and say, oh yeah, well, I know they called it this at the beginning, but now they want to call it that for the CD text.
It reminds me of when you call tech support somewhere, you call the cell phone company and you're like, we talked 6 months ago. And if they have a system where they've got this running list of things you discussed, you realize, it's like, oh, that's how they know what we talked about 6 months ago and again today. And, it's a reminder that we need to, take that lesson from that industry, perhaps, for what we do. And another takeaway too, and we talked about this recently on the show, is that I think it's smart that you are taking your system and adapting it to the chaotic way that information comes in from the world, as opposed to trying to put this effort into somehow teaching the world to speak in a more organized fashion. Because the truth is, next week you're going to be talking to a different group of chaotic incoming messages. Mm-hmm. So I think that's smart.
I'm also using the to-do list on the Google Calendar quite a bit to, make sure that whether just initial contacts or actual jobs don't fall through the cracks. Yeah.
That's good. And that's a good organizational tip too for the show.
Available on all devices. So it's always, whether you're a phone guy, laptop guy, or a desktop guy, it's available everywhere.
Well, and what I appreciate about you sharing your tips too is that it's a reminder, we live in this world of high tech and online stuff and cloud-based things. And I keep hearing, slight variations of how to do stuff from different people, which is a reminder that it's like us. It's find your personal way to organize and keep those notes together. And that's what's most important. Go all the way back to Bob Ludwig. He had a shorthand. You learned it, and that's what made it work. It didn't have to be the AAS standard for everybody necessarily, although I'm sure there were other parts of it that did become AAS standards. But I think that's good advice. Well, let me take us to the final closing question before we go. And I want to thank you again for being here on the show with us. This is hypothetical. You're going to go back and find young Andy Vandette and tap yourself on the shoulder and say, listen, dude, I know you want to be a rock star of the studio yourself one day, but here's the single most important thing you need to know to be able to do that. If you could go back and give yourself that advice, what would you do?
It would be I think I pointed out before that, God helps those who helps themselves, that nobody, especially in this market, is going to help you, promote you. You must find venues, whether you're speaking on a podcast or speaking at a school, or how are you going to connect with your next client? The fact that you create great sound, that's a given. That's not really the job. That's the fun part. Right. The job is you're going to run out of friends. You're not always going to be able to record your friends and your family. So what is going to keep that steady revenue stream? Because you're going to want to have some kind of a normal life, a car payment, a home, a family, and no one is going to keep going out there and finding you fresh clientele. You must constantly connect. There was a There was a person on staff when Masterdisk was trying to be a DVD authoring company, and he said once, a third of your clientele is already working with someone else. You just haven't found out about it yet. So you're constantly losing 30% of your clientele. And it's totally understandable. Musicians are creative people. They're all looking for that killer combination of production and mastering and promotion that's going to push their project to the next level. And if they didn't get it the last time around, even though you did a fine job, everyone raved about the sound of the record, they're still looking for, but this producer says I should use that other guy. Okay, well, they're going to do that. And you can't hold any negative feelings towards them for trying to find their magic combination.
Yeah.
But it does mean that you got to connect with 33% more clientele all the time.
It's like the what was it? It was like a can of cleaner that was sitting in the bathroom one day. I looked over and it just had this thing at the top. It said, now cleans 33.33% more things, even better. And that's what we have to do. I looked at it, I was like, I don't even know what that means. I think that just means I have to hustle harder. Awesome. Yes. Andy, thank you so much for being on Recording Studio Rockstars with us, too. It was a super pleasure hanging out with you. And again, a closing shout out. Thank you to Slough Hallaton for introducing us. Let the Rockstars know how they can find you online. How can they come master their next hit record with you?
Oh, sure. Well, I have my website is andyvandette.com. I'm all over Facebook. There's my personal page where you can see me Christmas morning in robot fuzzy sleep pants, or you can click on like for Andy Vandette Mastering. Those are my two primary. I'm also on the Engine Room website. And if you're in New York, I would be happy to give you a tour of the joint.
Oh, super cool. I'll have to take you up on that.
Oh, definitely.
Groovy. Well, Andy, thank you so much, man. And I look forward to meeting you in person.
Excellent.
Seeing you around the studio.
Thank you so much.
All right, man. Cheers. Thanks so much for listening to Recording Studio Rockstars. If you enjoyed the show and want to help make it better, then please share this episode with your friends on social media and leave a rating and review on iTunes to help the podcast reach more rock stars like yourself. You can click directly over to iTunes or go to rsrockstars.com/review for an easy explanation. Also, remember to hit the subscribe button to keep up with these weekly episodes. And if you're ready to make your best record ever, then head over to Recording Studio Rockstars Academy, where you can start with my free mixing course at mixmasterbundle.com. Look for the link in the show notes. And if you want more free content from Recording Studio Rockstars, all you have to do is go to rsrockstars.com/email. Again, that's rsrockstars.com/email to enter your name and email, and I'll keep you in the loop with articles, videos, podcast updates, and even free gear giveaways for your studio, all totally free. Thanks for listening, and thanks for being a rock star. I'm Lid Shaw, and this is Recording Studio Rockstars. Now, go make great music.